So I'm going to go through a lot of things that I've observed with the MetaQuest 3. You've seen me talk about some of the features, and as I've mentioned, there are so many great videos out there. I'm approaching it for something that matters to us. Remember, I'm not a technical diagnostician, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physical trainer. Nothing I'm talking about here is from a medical or scientific standpoint. These are simply my observations of things within the MetaQuest 3 or any device that we talk about that are relative to us from our viewpoint. I think it's critical to understand that many of the great reviews out there are talking about it from a gamer standpoint or a younger person standpoint, and thankfully for them, they cannot relate to some of our limitations, although that's the wrong word. They can't relate to how we view things, feel things, see things, smell things, hear things. And someday they will. But for now, this is about us. So the very first thing I want to point out, MetaQuest 3, as we talked about before, what I've noticed is that, as they said, the weight is no different, but the way that it feels to your face is so much tighter. And like anything else, if you had a massive device here, you'd feel it on your neck, and we're going to get fatigued no matter how much we exercise. So it's much more comfortable. So the first thing I noticed, other than the comfort on the head, which I just showed you, was how easy it is to set it up. And that might sound incidental, but it isn't. If you've ever tried to adopt new technology, it always sounds great until you start. Whether it's a new computer and you find out you have to update the software, the keyboard doesn't feel right, blah, blah, blah. Or you get a new iPhone and you think, oh, this is great, look at that, better camera. And next thing you know, you're trying to set it up all over again. Well, this was a lot easier for a lot of reasons. So if that's a barrier to you, is that you don't find technical challenges as fun as many people do, the setup was a lot easier. By pairing the device with the app does all the work. So the application on the phone basically takes that information and sets up your account. In the past, when you had to have other devices that were new, you had to enter your username, your password, it had to authenticate and do all that. Meta has put a lot of the heavy lifting into the app and basically transmits it to the device. So that's number one, I would say to you, in terms of the setup being easy. What wasn't as easy, there's a QR code to recognize your Wi-Fi. I didn't try that hard for it to work because frankly, it finds the network like everything does, and all you have to do is enter your password. So that wasn't such a big deal to me, but there was a way you could use a QR code. The other thing from a comfort and adaptability standpoint, the IPD, the Inter-pupillary Distance, is how the lenses fit. Now, we've talked before, and we're going to go into more detail about how the lenses themselves are far better for us and how the fit around the eyes are far better because you have more room for glasses without any special hardware to adapt to it. And when I say special, there are two little inserts. I don't mean that there's all kinds of things, but what's relevant is this. This is the IPD device, and it's great for us for several reasons. First of all, it's very easy because you don't have to reach in as you used to and adjust it, so you don't get the moisture and the grease and all those things and have to start over. It's also great for us because it will remember where we are. So if your setting is a 60 and you're sharing the device, as most likely you will be, you can now know, sort of like a sleep number bed, where you have your setting, and when you sit down, you just know where you are. So that is very useful for us because the accuracy is more important. We don't necessarily have to be fumbling through, and we can remember among multiple users. Also very relevant, as I have found, at least in the past, some types of uses, games, apps, are more comfortable with a different distance. Even for me, I might want to adjust a little bit. So it's puberty shot. It had to. So what's nice is that if you have to adjust, for example, going from meditation to a creative app, to a gaming app, to physical fitness, you might want to make adjustments. And it's nice just to be able to touch a button in the same way you would a volume control to make those changes and to experiment a little bit. So that is the benefit, is the IPD makes it more accurate, makes it easier to adjust, allows for multiple users very easily. So high quality resolution, very obvious. We've been seeing that on TVs our whole life, from black and white to color to Technicolor. Remember NBC's Peacock had Technicolor. Well, obviously, high quality resolution, the improved resolution, has so many obvious benefits. One, obviously, our eyes are going to be strained less, which is very relevant. Obviously, for us, not obviously, the fact that we might need glasses, it's easier to adapt with a better resolution. You just get a lot more flexibility. But it also allows for a far more entertaining experience. But what I've also found that's very interesting is, obviously, if you're watching Netflix or YouTube or just watching things, that's very interesting. But the higher resolution also comes in handy, not just with competitive games, whether it's golf or whether it's Racket NX or Beat Saber. What I've also found is that, for example, there is a meditation app or a focus app called Liminal, and they have a thing on there called Grid. And I experiment a little bit for us with that. And one of the things very cool about that is that the graphics are already very good and they're extraordinary. And while many of the things that we would use here are not yet optimized for the better graphics, the better resolution, I have found on something like Liminal, for example, where there are virtually 100 different globes, and each one that you hit creates an experience of awe. Well, I've had trouble because I couldn't see as well reaching out and hitting the spheres that are further away. But because of the resolution, sort of like stronger glasses, it enables you to do things you were already doing more easily, regardless of whether your hands shake a little bit or whether your focus isn't what it was. So that is the benefit, one of many benefits for the higher resolution. Okay, we talked about the higher resolution, and to me, it's related to pass-through. A technocrat might say, you're blending two unrelated things. Not for us. For us, the fact that there's higher resolution and better vision also comes into play with something called pass-through. And as I mentioned, that in the old Quest, there were just some cameras here and here. And the reason that's so important to anybody, but especially to us, is pass-through is where, when you're in your headset, instead of having to lift up to see what's going on, you can actually get access through a double click on the side of your headset, and you will see everything that's around you. In the past, pass-through was in black and white, and because the resolution wasn't as good, it was grainy. It was harder to see. And so it was certainly a beautiful idea. It was well executed, and it accomplished maybe 70% of what we need, maybe 50% actually. This is more like 90% because it's in color, it has the better resolution, and you can look down and see a toddler or a dog coming into view. You can also, if you have the larger font on the watch or your phone, you can actually see those things through the headset. And that's astounding to me, because you'd be surprised how many times, and you don't recognize it, you're having to lift the headset to check something. And in fact, even in the setup, which I mentioned easier being far earlier, even in the setup, which I mentioned earlier, is far easier. Many times you're looking at your phone for the app and then the device and your phone. So it's very nice not have to keep looking away, looking back, looking away. So the pass-through itself is an extraordinarily beneficial thing to us for safety, because if you're getting a little off balance, you double tap, you could see. You can certainly rip the headset off. But the pass-through from our standpoint is incredibly safe, more accommodating for maybe less vision, or our senses, our hearing may not be as good, and we can take a better look around. So that in itself, from a safety standpoint for us, is a game changer in my opinion. Next up were the controllers. If you remember the controllers I showed you before, they had a big loop around them. I think that was for hand tracking or whatever. These are obviously far more compact, which is good because in many cases when you have a heavier controller and you're trying to do movement, whether it's Beat Saber or even aiming at different things, lighter weight is better. Also, the other one felt to me like with that weight, it was weighted this way. And in the same way I mentioned that the headset may be the same weight, but being closer to your face puts less pressure on our face and and our eyes and our neck and our shoulders. In the same way, these having less weight that way may be academic to people, but for us, everything matters. Also, everything matters from the standpoint of not putting a strain on our body. Also, these feel much better to me, more lubricated. Some word, we know what we mean. They move better. How's that? They move better to me. And these buttons, because there's not a big loop in front of them, let's do this. How about that? These are the old controllers. So you can see the difference. The weight here pulls you down a little bit, and it feels like it's putting more pressure on my wrist and my thumbs, which, you know, the joints tend to, as we age, tend to get a little more tender. And you could see that the difference here, there's none of that. And if you compare the amount of energy it takes. Now that is just the actual grip and feel. And we're gonna look later on at some grip adjustments that we're gonna use so that we're not squeezing as much. I find that in not a lot of time, I'm starting to get tense in here. Even if you're not using games that require a great deal of energy, just holding something, if you've held a cup or a glass, after a while it gets tired. So we're gonna look at some inexpensive ways to do that. But for now, if you look at, to me, it rests very nicely in there. It also has a haptic feel. Haptic, H-A-P-T-I-C, are those things that give you actual kinetic feedback, so that if you don't see what you need to see or hear what you need to see, you get that. It also makes things feel more real, because it's no different than if you put a cup down and you hear that clink. Well, in this case, your hands will vibrate, and it also show you when you're more successful, which just adds another sense to the whole experience, which is more accommodating to everybody, but I think we'll feel it more than most. And the last thing that I have to relate to the liminal grid that I used earlier is that the spheres that I mentioned that are way back, besides being able to see better, I could aim a lot better. And I have found that some of the ones that are 3 or 4 back, I mean, I'm not shaking much, but it still was hard to get way back there. So that's just one application that I have fun with. That's the AWE setting, A-W-E, in liminal. But I found I got much more enjoyment. And also, when you're trying to be in awe or meditate or calm or get ready for bed, the last thing you need is the aggravation of trying to be able to reach things. Also, in other meditation apps like Trip, T-R-I-P-P, there are times where you're trying to figure out whether you should be using your hands or your controllers. I'm getting still more comfortable using the controller because these are lighter now. When you had the burden of this thing, you would be seeking more readily to have a lighter version, which are your hands. They're getting far more accurate, which is discussion for the next point. But even with something like that, where you're trying to navigate, it's just nice to have the accuracy, the comfort, the feel, the easier pressing, and of course, the haptic feedback. So that is one element of the controllers that are better with the MetaQuest 3. Again, in our case, I think it is substantially better. And as we continue to go from using our hands versus controllers and transitioning, even within the same 3 minutes of use, having a lighter controller that you can put away more easily than this is a great benefit to us to save us energy and frustration. Okay, we talked about before with the MetaQuest 3 and the 2, which you saw in the introduction, that the controllers are the primary interaction that you would have with games and with apps, even YouTube VR, other things where you're using these as guides, right? So in our world, we don't think of walking around with controllers. In our day, we might have had a stick shift, but now in our cars, and which is still very cool and fun. And I miss a little bit, even if I do have a self-driving electric car, which people ask me about. They're like, do you trust your car to drive itself? And I go, have you seen me drive? I would trust a grandchild to drive over me, in the same way that controllers are fine, but if you can do away with them, obviously it's one less thing to worry about. As I've mentioned, again, I find, I don't know that everybody would feel this, but the transition within an app to hands from controllers, I've found a little difficult. And part of it is embarrassingly. Sometimes I put things down, and ever happened to you where you put things down and can't remember them? Ever? Maybe once today, maybe once during this whole thing. So as mild as an inconvenience it seems, there are plenty of times where I put these away. So there are times that these get misplaced. So we are migrating to the world where it's just hands. And I have found several points for us. One, the fact that the controller is lighter. After a while, this isn't that much heavier, but it starts to get heavy on your wrist. For me, sometimes I just do that and leave them on there and use my hands if there's a situation where I'm going to need to go back and forth. But the hands are getting better on YouTube. If you're watching a show or any of those things, you can actually pinch like you're used to on a phone or an iPad, where you're expanding or pulling it in. So there's a lot you can do which makes the entire experience feel more real, but also less cumbersome. Not wondering where things are, not wondering which to use. So there's more and more. The cameras within the Quest are gonna have to see you. So there's times where you lose, but you'll get used to pretty quickly, or we'll learn together. Obviously, if your hands, not obviously, if your hands are way up here, you won't see them, or down there, but you'll get used to it. And I'm sure that they're gonna design more and more things on the headset and in the app that are accommodating to the hands. Hands are great for us, obviously, because there's no additional weight, and it's far more intuitive. We're not quite there. The other reason this is really important, both the controllers that we've talked about, and always important, our hands, is that they're getting more and more into mixed reality, and we're going to get into that in a minute as its own category. But for purposes of the controller, today's discussion, and the hands, today's discussion, the mixed reality is getting more intuitive with your hands versus the controller. So that's going to get more developed, and we'll talk more about that as a separate topic. So for now, the topic, beautifully, are hands. So, and controllers, by that we don't mean people controlling us. The whole point is that we control them. But sometimes technology does feel like it's controlling us. Let's talk about boundaries for a minute. And I don't mean when your daughter or granddaughter goes out on a date. I don't mean those kind of boundaries. And it's not a basketball play. So what is it then? What am I talking about? So a boundary is something that you do inside the Quest with your controller, and it creates the play area. And there's two kinds of boundaries. There's stationary, where literally if you're watching a movie or whatever, it draws a circle around you and you're not going anywhere. And if you move even that much, you're out of the boundary, or if you move that much. So that's fine if you're meditating. That's fine if you don't want to move because you have a significant other, or if you're taking care of somebody and you know you shouldn't be moving around. That's a stationary boundary. And that's pretty easy to do. You basically click, whenever you go, let me step over. You always need a boundary. And that is important because there are times where you just want to real quick do something, and it can be a little irritating. You're like, I just want to look, I don't need a boundary, but it does require you to have a boundary. So the stationary boundary is easy. You sit down, we'll do that together. Basically, it'll create a little stationary boundary, and there you are. But in a room scale boundary, where you're going to be moving around, it'll set in a room scale boundary where you're going to do Beat Saber or Pistol Whip or just walk around. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't watch a movie while you're walking around, but it is a matter of having a boundary, an area where it will allow you to manipulate yourself, meaning move around. If you step out of the boundary, it will immediately go into what is called pass-through. And pass-through is what we talked about just moments ago, about when you want to see what's going on outside of the headset. So what's so great now, and it's a little glitchy. I have found creating boundaries even in the MetaQuest 2. So basically you get there, you point, it says create a boundary, and you will draw an area around you that is sufficient to move. And depending on the size of the room, you can make the boundary bigger or smaller. The games are designed not to be walking all over the place. Obviously, even if you're golfing, you're standing and the course is moving. Having said all that, because of the new higher resolution and all kinds of technological advancements that I don't understand, what's beautiful is you put the headset on and then it scans the room and it automatically creates the boundary. And I experimented a little bit for us because sometimes the boundary is too big, or there's an area of our home where we need a specific space to accommodate anything that we might have unique to us. And what I'm saying there is that instead of having to draw it ourselves, it scans the room. Now, there have been discussions about there being a lack of security because basically they can see your room. I mean, they can see wherever you are, but you can choose what stores in the cloud and what's local. I'll look into further whether boundary is one of those, but nonetheless, you need a boundary anyway. And then it also allows you to scan the room to create mixed reality. Whole different discussion. Right now, the point here is simple. Instead of having to draw your own boundary, it does a very neat scan of the room, creates a boundary, and from a safety standpoint, it's nice to know that it's recognizing objects we may have missed. It's nice to know that there is something that is basically working with us to create something safe and convenient. And most important, if you're concerned about balance or nausea, all things we've talked about, and you're sitting down, there's a stationary boundary, you sit still, and you go from there. So that whole concept is the idea of a boundary or a guardian that maintains you within a safe confine as you move around with the Quest.